Hi, and welcome to the second ever webinar or panel discussion in the best practice series for Bedrock Learning. We are focusing on disciplinary literacy today. This is an area that crops up time and again, and particularly in light of the 2019 Education Endowment Foundation's recommendations for schools. It was their number one focus: prioritize disciplinary literacy. And I know a lot of schools and a lot of teachers, hands on heart, actually weren't quite sure what it meant. So there's that, and then there's also how do we put in place strategies, and going forward, how do we get staff buy-in? Because that seems to be the number one. Okay, we've got all these great plans, but how do we put them into place and make sure that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet? So we've got some really exciting panelists for you today. I'm just going to go around to get them to introduce themselves briefly, what their role is, where they work, and then it'll give you more an idea when they're responding to questions, what's their context and why it might be that they've chosen their particular strategies to make sure that disciplinary literacy is prioritized. So from what I can see, I'll start with Charlotte. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Evans. I am the literacy lead for the Harris Federation secondary schools. So we have 28 now, and growing always, but making sure, obviously, my role is to make sure that literacy is at the heart of every single one of those academies' agendas. I am based in school, and I'm actually based at Harris Academy Peckham now, but my role is cross-federation lead practitioner, and I'm also a SENCO at those sites. So it's in such a diverse role, but it's so great. And obviously, being a SENCO, literacy falls into every area, and it's been incredibly fascinating starting to lead across different schools, and it's probably the most exciting part of my role, because every school is so unique and every school has different student context, and therefore requires a slightly different approach to disciplinary literacy. So it's never one size fits all, and we'd never assume that it did. So I'm really excited to look at best practice today as well, because I'm sure there'll be lots of things that fit certain schools and certain things that wouldn't be as well. So very exciting, very pleased to be here. So thanks for having me, Alexandra.
Oh, thanks for coming. I actually should say, I remember last session, the other panelists were taking notes as well. So it's sort of CPD for everyone. But yeah, it's great to share good practice. Elisabeth, do you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Elisabeth Pickles. I teach history at Highworth Grammar School in Kent, but I did a PhD alongside my teaching in students' use of historical sources, and their understandings of words and interpretations of text is a really important part of that. So following that, I was invited to be part of the advisory panel for the Education Endowment Fund when they were producing their book on literacy, disciplinary literacy, that Alexandra has referred to. Another of my roles in school is Equal Opportunities Lead. So I'm very involved in looking at overcoming disadvantage. And there's masses of research evidence that literacy really is at the heart of that. So I'm involved working with representatives from lots of different departments in the school, trying to look at strategies for enhancing students' literary skills across all, the curriculum. So.
Fantastic. So lots of wealth of experience there to draw from. Krisha?
Hi everybody, my name is Krisha Hendra, and I am an assistant principal at Swindon Academy, which is part of the United Learning Trust, and I am in charge of whole school literacy as well as year 11, and I used to be head of English as well. But we're quite, I would say, still at the starting points in terms of embedding literacy, and a lot of my work has been around vocabulary, which is what got me in contact with Bedrock and Alexandra in the first place. And we have been on quite a journey in terms of ensuring that staff felt confident with the literacy and teaching literacy within their subjects as well. So we've taken things a little bit differently by focusing primarily around vocabulary as well.
Okay, I should say we're getting, to Bronnie, but all of you wear many hats. I can't believe, there's not just one class teacher. You're doing lots and lots of different roles. I can't believe it. Right, okay, Bronnie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Bronnie Williams. I'm slightly different to the rest of the panel today in that I work in primary schools. So I'm based at Cornerstone Academy Trust, which is a small trust in Devon. We have 4 schools, and my role is that I'm a year 6 class teacher, but I also lead Key Stage 2 across the trust, and I'm on the English faculty, kind of specialising in reading and writing. And obviously a big part as a year 6 teacher of my role is also around transition and that aspect of it. So I'm sure that a lot of what's going to be discussed today is going to be really relevant to me. So I'm excited to hear from the rest of the panelists as well. Yeah. Okay,
well, I'll start us off with I don't know if you've all noticed, but I draw from the Education Endowment Foundation, and that's going to be our springboard for discussions today. But I just picked out a few quotations which sort of stood out. And all of you have talked about, you know, your roles in CPD at your school in terms of literacy. So the idea that all teachers should be supported to understand how to teach students to read, write, and communicate effectively in their subjects. When staff come to your school, this is actually, I've gone a bit off piece, but just your opinions. When staff come to school, or when teachers first start teaching, would you say that they are fully prepared and fully sort of trained up in this, or is it an ongoing thing?
I just think we've had a really pertinent conversation recently, obviously, as we're in the recruitment phase ready for next year, lots of initial teacher training placements being offered. And one of my sort of answers to a later question was around making sure that even at interview and recruitment, that is a question, and that literacy forms part of that interview process. But actually what we're finding is most initial teachers feel that their training hasn't equipped them to know the reading and writing and communication skills needed specific to their subject. They've been trained as subject specialists and within the pedagogy of teaching, but that literacy has always been sort of seen as a small add-on for students, that the old style view, it's for students who aren't at the right curriculum level for them yet. And they see literacy as only being that. So that's one of the barriers as well as to why we don't have staff buy-in. But I would say a lot of the new teachers I speak to as part of because we're a teaching school as well, actually no, they didn't feel equipped. So it's something we've addressed at a teaching school level as well as then once they're in schools.
Yeah, I see Krisha nodding along there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm actually finding that in some aspects, because of the research around disciplinary literacy and vocabulary becoming more commonplace, that sometimes the newer teachers do have more of an understanding, or are quite keen to follow up and perhaps do projects for potentially their Teach First projects, etc., around literacy and vocabulary. However, there is still that kind of fear around literacy. So we kind of try and address that through putting in additional training for all staff at the start of the year with a base camp, etc. But there is quite a lot to cover, and it's definitely a huge challenge, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Next one that I sort of picked out, and actually, this doesn't really need any explanation, but, you know, students that cannot read, write, and communicate highly effectively are highly unlikely to access challenging academic curriculum and more likely to have poor educational outcomes across all subjects. And I know this was said in relation to transitions from primary schools. I didn't know if, Bronnie, you had any strategies that you have in place across your trust that sort of prepare students for that transition? Because it seems to, you know, it's a big change from just one classroom teacher to many teachers.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, as a teacher, a primary teacher, you're often told it's a terrifying fact that the vocabulary that the children are assessed at having when they enter primary school and reception is often the best indicator of their GCSE results, and that itself is just a terrifying thought, because, you know, we all know the journey that they're going to go on in that time. In terms of transition and in terms of that, I think for us as a trust, we have identified, we're also an English hub. So we've identified that reading is fundamental to everything that we do, and our CEO is very passionate and always says that every lesson should be a reading lesson. And I think as we've started to focus also more on vocabulary, that's also become every lesson should be an opportunity to develop vocabulary as well. So I think that's always very much at the forefront of everything that we do. But obviously, it's a big step up to transition from year 6 to secondary school. But I think for us, it's about harbouring a sense of independence and equipping them with strategies that they can use where they're not necessarily always reliant on the processes that we use as a primary school, because obviously what they go on to use at secondary is potentially going to be very, very different. So it's about giving them tools that are versatile enough that they can be applied in any setting, in any teacher's classroom, moving forward. So that's a broad overview of our strategy, but obviously it's more nuanced than that in the detail, but yeah.
Yeah. I will go on to, it's the reading of different types of texts, isn't it, in different subjects. Well, I was going to, this also jumped out at me. So teachers are often undertrained in the literacy demands of their subject, using a range of new types of texts, which are often dense and more technical. Such challenges can create a literacy gap. Now, I thought this would be a nice place for Elisabeth, you to tell me. We were sort of talking before this webinar about students, being able to pick apart sources for historical sources. What kind of challenges come up there?
I think one of the key things, particularly in history, but perhaps more generally, is to encourage in students, in a way, greater caution when they approach words. That we live in an age when students want very quick answers and have very little patience with things that don't seem immediately apparent. So my PhD research, when I did it in 19 different secondary schools with Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 5 students, and presented students with a range of texts and asked them to talk through them and reach conclusions. And they were very quick to just hone in on parts of the source which they thought they understood and reach conclusions. Whereas the sort of highest level of thinking was actually to be cautious and to unpack and to consider the context of words, and to, they might to start say, well, this, seems to suggest something, but actually did that word really mean that in that particular context? And I think that is really fundamental to developing literary skills in the secondary school, that even apparently quite straightforward words, they are used in subtly different ways in different subjects. And obviously in history, there's the extra dimension that they're used in subtly different ways in different periods. So obviously we need to encourage students to think about other contexts where they've used that word, because that may well give them clues. But at the same time, they need to be cautious and to have strategies for testing out. Does, what I think this word means in this context, does that fit with other things I know about that context? So it's a highly complex process. And I think part of it, it's important to encourage students to develop strategies, but also the motivation to be prepared to invest some time and effort into this, and not just expecting quick fixes.
Yeah, I think it goes back to critical thinking. It takes time and focus and resilience. Learning is challenging, and actually, we can't be assuming things and just have a quick fix. But very interesting. So we've got a clearer idea of each of your contexts. I'm just going to go around each of you. So what does disciplinary literacy look like at your school, Charlotte? Or your schools, actually, because there's a number of schools.
Yeah, I think I'd definitely start with the Federation as a whole, because I think that's been a really interesting process of every school's on a very different journey. I think, as I said before, every single school has a completely unique curriculum, a completely unique set of child's context. And I think I found fascinating what was just written in the chat about the nuances of vocabulary about being beyond the school gates. So I think one thing we've certainly had to consider when we consider what disciplinary literacy would look like for us is we had to consider that the majority of our schools are in incredibly deprived areas, and many of the context of students, linking with Elisabeth's role around equal opportunities and closing that sort of deprivation gap, we've had to teach the context of a lot of these nuances of words because they actually haven't encountered them outside the school gate where you feel they might have or should have. And we just haven't been able to assume everything. And I really appreciated that comment. And I thought that was really pertinent in the chat. So I wanted to pick up on that first. But I would say when we first thought about delivering it across the Federation, we had to start with a vision before we decided about how it would exactly look. Otherwise, the buy-in wouldn't be there from every site. So we came up with what we've sort of dubbed, it's our word well vision. And we've changed literacy to word because it's writing, oracy and reading development to try and take away that old style view of literacy being for low prior attainers. And we've made it a well vision because it's about their well-being, their inquiry skills, their learning and their life outside of school when they leave here. And we can't take away from the fact that without key literacy skills and without being competent communicators, their well-being will be significantly affected now in school and also when they leave. So we had to start there. Otherwise, there was no way we were going to work out exactly what would work for us. Then it has been down to each individual site to then decide what their strategy looks like, and then further down, once the academy has decided what each subject has as their individual subject disciplinary literacy action plan, because it's different everywhere. So it's sort of looking at it at different layers and monitoring that really carefully, but providing literacy leads with the knowledge first to be able to really drive that in their academies and push that forward. We've been very lucky to have sent all of our heads of department in our EBAC subjects of maths, humanities, science, MFL joined and English to go on a disciplinary literacy training specifically for their subject curriculum. And that really helped them to develop their action plans because they had the knowledge to move forward. And that was through the National Literacy Trust. And I can't recommend it enough in terms of their programme. And we had a very bespoke one because we had large numbers joining each programme, but they do run it already. So I think that was incredible for us. And where each plan is unique, a lot of what I'm looking at with literacy leads is being a sounding board for them from the training. Have we implemented enough strategies in each area? Is it reading that needs the key focus first? I know that Bronnie mentioned every lesson's a reading lesson. And I absolutely love that. I think that's totally true. So is it that some academies need to completely revolutionise their reading strategy before they move on to the writing side? If we think about reading leading on to writing, but never forgetting that the purpose is to create subject experts, and that a mathematician and a geographer have very different demands on them. So when we're creating a whole academy action plan, starting to consider how we support those students who go to maybe 6 different lessons a day and have to switch very quickly in their brain from being cautious in a historical text to being cautious reading a graph in maths, because it's still those same reading skills, but making sure our maths specialists know how to adopt the same reading approach, but in their specific way. So I know Alex Quigley, we've been very lucky to have him do some training for us as well. And it's been incredible around the before, during and after approach to reading, and making sure that across our sites, we're adopting that in every subject. But when we're reading a graph, you still do those metacognitive stages. And the hope is that by year 11, we've got really competent students that can do it themselves without us highlighting it to them. But whether it be a graph, whether it be a picture in art, because you're reading that, and, you know, that beautiful process of being able to understand what's in front of you takes us back to that well-being vision. So that's kind of a really quick snapshot of actually an incredibly large project and process, but an incredibly exciting journey for each of our academies at the moment. And I know that we're going from strength to strength as we're moving through each one, and it is a journey, and we're currently looking at what we plan for next year based on where we are after a year.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, to be able to summarize so many different moving parts, it is a real skill. But I like the idea of students just shaping meaning in their world around them, and that whether it be a graph or a picture or, you know, a whole bunch of text in a history textbook, or and being able to switch. I mean, I always use the example, analyze in English is going to be very different to the skill analyze in science, or, you know, so they do have to be able to switch with their 6 lessons a day. Elisabeth, what does disciplinary literacy look like at your school?
Well, at our school, it's very much sort of departmentally based. I work in a school where we're very much encouraged to, rather than, you know, being all told that we've got to follow a similar pattern, that departments are encouraged to develop their own ways of working, because subject needs are very different. But then I have meetings with each department has a pupil premium lead, we call them, that meet with me termly and feed back. And literacy has been one of our big foci this year, that departments are trying out slightly different things. I've had training from Alex Quigley and I've fed that back to them, but then just which bits of it and how they implement it and how they approach things is different in different subjects. And that, I think, is really healthy, to be encouraging colleagues to think through these issues for themselves from their own subject point of view, rather than all trying to fit into, you know, one sort of framework, but then to be sharing, because we can certainly learn a lot from each other. Some things may need tweaking and adapting in different subjects, but to be conscious that this is something that we're all needing to work on, I think is really important.
Yeah, and it's really nice that in each department there are those pupil premium leads. I know at some schools they have, you know, literacy leads within each department that will take the lead on that and share what you're feeding back as well. So and that's definitely something that comes up in the EEF recommendations, is that subject specific, being careful not just to be too general, and balancing the two, definitely. Krisha, what does disciplinary look like at your school?
Hi, it's been really fascinating hearing how it has been approached really differently. And I think one of our ambitions is to have kind of like the schools like Charlotte and Elisabeth have been talking about, where subject leads feel confident in different subjects with disciplinary literacy. We're quite at a different stage. So when I took on the role with literacy, I knew it was a huge priority, but when I read the EEF report and had some training by Alex Quigley, realised we need to do reading, writing, vocabulary, everything. And I knew that we couldn't possibly do that. We couldn't do that with the staff, and it would take time. So I started off focusing on vocabulary, that as our main way to gain develop expertise with our staff as well. So we've done quite a lot of, and we started off by looking at how we teach vocabulary and increasing staff's confidence with etymology, morphology, and breaking down words. So they have done quite a lot of work on developing vocabulary curriculums for their individual subjects and identifying the key tier 3 vocabulary and some tier 2 vocabulary for their particular subjects, but also identifying the patterns and those kind of nuances and the little the kind of key areas that they needed to develop. So that's kind of been our key focus, and it's actually been quite a journey. So we use the SEEK, the model that Alex Quigley talks about about selecting words, exploring words, explaining words, and then consolidating. And we actually plan the training around that throughout this year. And we're now in a position where leaders are kind of like developing what they will do next time. So we've kind of identified that writing will be a focus in particular subjects, and then going on to looking at reading, but systematically looking at it and actually building up confidence over time has been a key strategy. And I think that's been a positive in the sense that we can kind of develop staff's confidence in one area of literacy before developing others as well.
And also it means that the approach is coherent and you can use it next year and the year after, because, you know, they've actually gone through their curriculum and planned. And very much like the Ofsted education inspection framework recommends, that actually you need to go back to the curriculum. What does it look like? What do we need to teach?
Absolutely.
And then, you know, it sounds like, okay, but actually you've got to get those foundations right.
Absolutely. And it takes a lot of time, because I said to staff that I love Doug Lemoff's line, which is vocabulary is knowledge, and of all forms of knowledge, perhaps the most important. And that's what we use with staff, is that, we have a knowledge-based curriculum and vocabulary is a key part of it. It's not something additional, it's fundamental. And that's been really useful to kind of identify that, but then build in the time for them at this stage to kind of evaluate the words they selected. So we were really strict with, it's not all the words, it's kind of, I took what Alex Quigley had said, and one word that you're really going to drill down and teach in depth as well. So
yeah,
was quite a big part.
Yes, and also, you want students to remember it. Cognitive overload, if they've got a list of 100 words, it's not going to work. Yeah. Okay, so Bronnie, what does disciplinary literacy look like at your trust?
So
English Hub.
It's obviously a little bit different. I think not only are we slightly different to secondary, we're also quite different to other primary schools, in that we do a lot of project-based learning within our schools. So actually a lot of the delivery of certain subjects isn't always discrete or specific, but all of our learning is outcome driven. So for example, with English, we actually don't do a lot of teaching of discrete English skills because it's often embedded within projects that have wider curriculum links. So it's a little bit different, yes, so we would always give them an outcome and opportunities, not only to, so when we're teaching with vocabulary, we don't give them opportunities just to learn the new words and maybe use them in their writing, but we try to always give them opportunities to apply those words practically as well. So whether that's they're building something, or they're taking part in a performance, or they're writing a letter, or they're doing a presentation, whatever it might be, we try to give them as many different varied ways to apply their knowledge of different bits of vocabulary to make sure that that's really embedded. And that's the same with our reading. We try to always give them a purpose for reading, rather than just doing reading comprehension tasks that are really dull and the kids don't engage with at all. We always try and embed that within a project, that therefore means they have the motivation, which I think Elisabeth was saying earlier, which is so important, to actually want to engage with that literacy element of the curriculum. So a little bit different, but yes, it's still, I think, in terms of pre-selecting key pieces of vocabulary and not overwhelming them, like you were saying, Alexandra, with the cognitive overload, all of those kind of pre-thought, premeditated parts of our planning are very much part of those broader projects as well.
Yeah, I liked the tapping into the motivation there. I can imagine, they go the extra mile if they're doing a project they're really fascinated by. So yeah, I like that. Right, okay, shall we go on to the next one? So the next one is, I'm looking for sort of anecdotes and strategies. All teachers love to share anecdotes and strategies and bits of evidence. How do you embed disciplinary literacy across the board? We kind of tapped on it, but let's just go around. Rather than go around, actually, does anyone want to start us off and we'll have it more of a discussion? Anyone got any anecdotes about disciplinary literacy? I know, Charlotte, you had one for me earlier on the phone. You were saying you were sending in the subject title, it said disciplinary literacy. Was it you?
Yes, we'd sent something round and we were sending it, and obviously the subject line of the email was disciplinary literacy, and what came back was, oh, are you sure you mean disciplinary literacy? And they had taken the word disciplinary to mean something HR related potentially, and just sort of seen it as, oh gosh. And it generated a really great discussion just around the nuances of words again, and going back to what Elisabeth was saying, how actually that could cause some fright and fear. So I guess that was more of a sort of funny anecdote around vocabulary that Alexandra and I were sort of discussing. But what we were sending round at that particular point was around, we've sort of tended to adopt as much as possible this before, during and after approach, because we're also trying to link in with the EEF's research around metacognition, and actually the fact that, like, I think it was Bronnie that was saying, giving students enough tools to be able to then use them later when you're not there. and versatile enough in lots of different places. So even using before, during and after, I know it's delivered by Alex Quigley and it's adopted by speech and language therapists around reading, but actually starting to use it for writing as well, going with that cautious approach. Before I write, what do I need to do first? Let's not go for a quick outcome and that instant gratification of producing a piece of work, but actually during that during phase as well. And I love that you kept saying the word cautious, Elisabeth, because it really made me think about the during phase of all of our areas with vocabulary, reading and writing and speaking. Actually, do students take enough time to pause while they're reading? Did I understand what I just read? Or while they're writing, actually, is this hitting the checklist for being a historian? Or am I writing like an evaluative artist? Are they being encouraged to pause and stop? So I do think certainly the before, during and after is something I've seen work really well in a few sites, and I know some sites are in the early stages of adopting it, and some are really flourishing with doing it for vocabulary, oracy, reading and writing. And I just think it has huge power to develop our students forever moving forward, not just when they've got a teacher in front of them. We know they're going to leave our gates at 16, 18, or for Bronnie at age 11. Have they got the skills? So I think strategy wise, linking it with metacognition is a big passion that I think we need to hone in on.
And I haven't actually used before, during and after in the classroom myself, so it's interesting hearing you explain it. I'm assuming during they've got to really think about the purpose of the writing and the audience and the language. It just comes back to that constantly. Yeah,
absolutely.
Or as they're reading as well. Why are they writing like this? Why are they? Okay, would anyone else like to sort of expand on that, or?
I can go.
Go on then, Krisha.
I'm fascinated by before, after, and during. I've written loads of notes, Charlotte, about that strategy because I'm really interested about just how that could be enacted later. The bit that we've done is it's just around a really small part. It's around Freya models and looking at how staff use them. And I found that that's been a really useful thing because it's meant that staff had to think really hard about vocabulary, and it's been a real challenge. And it's also helped because we could identify where the gaps are in terms of not knowing about, should we talk about prefixes here, should we talk about morphology or etymology? So in terms of the planning side of things, we did ask subjects to create Freya models for the words they're going to teach explicitly, which works out as about one a week that you'd look at. And it really, I think that's been a key part. One of the challenges is to make sure that that's into all the lessons. But I think a bonus of that is that you have that common language that so students don't go from lesson to lesson, have a slightly different explanation of the vocabulary. In departments, they're explaining that word in that subject specific way, and that's kind of so the Freya model, although we kind of designed it with students in mind, it's been a really useful tool for teachers to have really great explanations, and that's something that we're continually driving forward. So that's been something that's kind of springboarded lots of other things, and we've said that kind of we know that's going to go well when the students can speak and write as scholars in that particular subject. So when we've taught that well, that's when we're going to know that that's happening. So yeah,
I like the Freya model being across. You always have that power of practice. That's just how they're learning that language, but it's within a different subject areas.
Exactly.
But anyone that's, I don't know if we've got the question, but anyone that's not aware of Freya models, are you able to just explain what it is in the simple terms? It's
just a graphic organizer. It just breaks down that language into different key elements, and you can change what you break it down as. So for example, you can have a little image. We kind of dual code ours. We have a little image that links it, and we try and keep that image with that word all the way throughout. Again, cognitive load, and then it has a clear definition that's done in a student-friendly way. And we use Doug Lemoff's directions for how to create really student-friendly definitions, which is also in Alex Quigley's book. It's got similar, and we had a criteria for how to write a really simple definition. And then etymology, morphology, prefixes, suffixes, but subjects choose which bits they focus on because it's not appropriate for every subject. And then examples and non-examples. But again, in some subjects, they vary that to suit what they want to talk about in terms of vocabulary. And synonyms and antonyms and all of those things. So so English used those, but some other subjects, it just wasn't a thing. Irrelevant, so... Interesting. Any anecdotes for Elisabeth or Bronnie?
Just one or two other comments that in terms of embedding disciplinary literacy, I think it's really important not just to do things with staff, but to develop approaches in students that they feel increasingly confident in raising questions. And since I've really had a focus on literacy in my own history teaching, I found that my students, and I really welcome this, I think it's great, they're much more ready to ask questions about the meaning of words, whereas in the past they would maybe just have glossed over and hope it didn't matter too much. And I think if students are coming to all of their lessons aware of the importance of words and the subtleties of words, and feeling ready and open to ask questions, which can then lead to dialogue, and you can encourage them to unpack words and so on and so forth. That I think. So I think as well as doing things with teachers, it's important to do things with students so that they feel they're in an environment when talking about words is part of what we do. And we don't all expect to know what words mean. And I think sometimes it's very good as a teacher to say, well, yeah, I'm not quite sure what that word means in that context. What can we do to find out? So that sort of approach, I think, should feed into healthy disciplinary literacy in all areas of the curriculum.
Yeah. And that actually, it's almost like creating a culture where everyone's a bit more word conscious.
Yes.
And yeah, just showing that process on the board. Wow, I need to double check that. Let's have a think. How would I break it down? And yeah, I have had, teachers contacting and saying once they've got into the practice of, exploring synonyms and antonyms, they start saying, what's the synonym of this? What's the synonym? Just because, like you say. And I think that's great. And actually, I know from experience, Latin and Greek roots, once you start showing them those, there's a real fascination for them among students. They're sort of, okay, that's why it's spelled like that. That's interesting, So giving them the tools and playing around with language. Bronnie, any anecdotes from your sort of project-based approach? And I know I've actually listened to a couple of the conferences from the Cornerstone's English Hub, and there's just so many exciting ideas that you guys lead with.
Yeah, I was nodding along with Elisabeth because actually that was a big part of our, particularly focusing on vocabulary, a big part of our CPD program, and the key message that we were giving to teachers really was, first of all, to show that professional curiosity around vocabulary and to model to the children that it is exactly like Elisabeth saying, it's okay not to know the meanings of words, and to absolutely call yourself out on it and say, I don't know what that word means. So exactly what Elisabeth was saying. But also another key message was for staff, I guess it's more tempting to do this in a primary school setting, but don't dumb down your vocabulary. So don't use words that they will understand. Use words that are synonyms for those words. And they may not understand them, but encourage them to ask. And even when you're giving simple instructions in the classroom, like if you're saying hand out the books, don't say hand out the books, say distribute the books, and have that conversation around what does that mean, and give them the opportunity to experience it. So it wasn't just the subject specific vocab, actually day-to-day use of vocabulary as well. So absolutely agreed with Elisabeth around that. I was going to say something else, but I've completely forgotten it now. But yeah, so I was thinking that all the way through and nodding along. If it comes back to me, I'll let you know, Alexandra. But
what you were talking about there, Liv in the office here, she calls it semantic padding. So you'd start off with the tricky vocabulary that they might not have heard of before, and then you do it naturally with small children, and it's just keeping that going because that's how they learn language. Okay, so let's go on to the next one, and this for me is quite crucial because you're all sort of leaders in your settings, and this is key. I put unity of vision. I don't want that to be confused with, we're all going to take the same generic approach. It's just more, we're all on the same page, and this is important for all of us. And it's going to be, disciplinary literacy within my subject. I'm going, I'm incentivized and I feel supported in pushing that. So how do you ensure staff buy-in, Charlotte?
I think it's really multi-layered, and I think whenever I'm thinking about staff buy-in at all, I always try and think about the head, the heart, and the hand. So the ability to do it, what's in staff's minds, but also the fact that no teacher came into the profession without the heart to kind of change children's lives. And I think if teachers, because they don't come into education not wanting to do right by their students, if literacy is a barrier in their subject or in their classroom, it's not because they don't want to do it, it's probably because they don't know how at that point to change it and address it. So I think professional learning has to be at the heart of any vision or unity of vision, but also how well disciplinary literacy is advertised and promoted constantly around the school. You know, is the principal completely pushing it all the time? Is it led and that vision constantly talked about by a senior leader who can push it through at all levels? And then has that been disseminated all the way down? Have you got all staff completely bought into this vision? And I know that's not saying how, and saying that's what we all desperately want to happen. But I think the knowledge, giving staff the knowledge being power, actually staff then feel completely happy and ready to deliver these things. If we come in and we say, right, everyone's a teacher of literacy and you're all going to teach vocabulary, reading and writing well in your subject, I think we would have staff completely like, literacy is not my job, that old style kind of, I'm not an English teacher. And we don't see that so much anymore. And I think that is due to the professional learning and that belief in staff, instilling that literacy is their subject, and there is no subject where there isn't reading. There's no subject where students don't talk. There's no environment in the world where students won't have to talk. And I think instilling that reminder to them, because I know they know it, but how often is it talked about? And then I think as well, how often do we celebrate students for their disciplinary literacy around the school? How much are we displaying incredible pieces of writing from geography and really highlighting that? Because that makes teachers want to get their students up on the wall. Do we have disciplinary literacy halls of fame where just incredible writing? Do we have chances for students to be on the debating platform and use their language in that way? Because I think that helps teachers really buy into this, but letting them know that it's all part of growing students in their subject. And I think staff need to know it's for the purpose of their subject. So once they see that the no excuse vocabulary is directly linked to the schema of their entire curriculum, they then buy in because it's their subject they love. So I think there's lots of facets to it, and it's definitely not a quick win. But professional learning, if I was to summarize in 2 words, would absolutely be how you get staff buy-in for us. And that's worked really well.
I like that sort of like why, coming back to the purpose, it's just that sort of reminder is really, really useful. It kind of reminds me of when I was working in Hackney, the English department. So I know obviously it doesn't rest on the English department, but we would often do twilight sessions where we just, go over grammatical things like apostrophes and Pacmans and things for all the teachers. A little bit of fun. It was sort of interactive, but then, IT teachers, business teachers, they would feel like, okay, yeah, we're all in this together. So it was sort of a team building exercise whilst doing a bit of training as well. So, okay, Elisabeth, how do you ensure staff buy-in?
I think crucial. I mean, I would agree with everything Charlotte was saying, but I think it's really crucial as part of that to get across to staff and to students just how important vocabulary is to success. I mean, I can't remember who it was, but somebody mentioned earlier on, I mean, there's a wealth of research evidence now. I think it was Bronnie talking about, how much vocabulary you know when you start primary school predicts your GCSEs. And there's a lot of research about the association with social disadvantage. And I think, all teachers want to help students who've got disadvantages in their lives overcome that, and if sharing that sort of research and sharing all that's available now into just how important vocabulary is to success in all subjects, or certainly in a range of subjects, I think that is really important, that they need the strategies, but they also need to see just how important it is in doing what they want to do.
And that's the thing, when you're first starting in teaching and when you're training, you do have the time to do that research and reading. Often it's actually staff don't have the time. So I'm just going to plug the Bedrock Learning podcast here, because Liv and I, we read a lot of recent research like the Oxford Language Report and other bits and pieces, and we're breaking it down and how it's applied in the classroom. So if that is something that, you know, staff would be interested in, it might be worth a listen. All right then, I like that. Keeping up with research, I think, is key, and that kind of ties in with your professional learning. It needs to be constant. Krisha, how do you ensure staff buy-in?
And that was really interesting. You mentioned about that podcast. That sounds brilliant. That's absolutely spot
We
on.
enjoyed doing it. Yeah,
It was definitely on my mind because I'd had some training by Alex Quigley, I'd read his book, and my mind was very much in it, but I knew that lots of people, it was far from their minds. There were so many other things. I had a bit of time during the last lockdown to kind of think about how we might do it. So we did a bit of pre-reading, which I think was quite successful. So I just selected the bit. So there's a bit from Read and Reconsidered, and Doug Lamoff talks about vocabulary. The Oxford Language Report, bits of that to share the national pictures. And I actually just gave them the page numbers and snipped what they needed to read. The Improving Literacy in Secondary Schools, but I just directed them to the first two recommendations, not the whole thing, because I knew that they would go off and read perhaps, and it gives them the bits, but just kind of selecting those key things that I wanted them to look at. And then that was for subject leaders. So we presented to subject leaders first, and we talked about why it was so important for our school, particularly in terms of being in an area of high deprivation, really high pupil premium. This was going to be one of the strategies that we all needed to do. And we'd also done Bedrock for a year. So they'd kind of seen that come through, because I said to them, when we started Bedrock, we're going to make the students do the work first, and then we're going to build on that. So that kind of tied into that. And that pre-reading, which we have something called subject masterclasses. So then we talked to the subject leads about using a subject masterclass to then use that research in the with their teams, and then start the reading had a few key questions that I'd kind of picked out, and then they had to kind of pick up the things they were not sure about or wanted to discuss further. So they already came to it with an understanding of the big why, of the big picture of what's going on and why it's so important. So that, I think, was quite fundamental. And then I would really recommend the RAG audit tool that's linked to the EEF report, because right at the start, I got subject leaders to RAG where they thought their department was. And we've just come to the end of the first year, and they're now going to re-RAG. But I thought, and they're going to then develop their department priorities based on that. But I thought, in terms of practical strategy, that EEF audit tool is so good to get people to reflect on themselves and where they are, and it kind of then helps to drive forward what success looks like, because it says, what does exemplary practice looks like, what does good practice look like, what does developing practice look like. So it kind of gives that additional framework that's not you just saying it, but it's kind of like a really good tool to use as well.
Yeah, and it's a really great time of year to start looking at that as well, thinking about planning for next year. Yeah, I like that. And also, Charlotte, before we actually started the webinar, you were mentioning how actually lockdown had been a good time to reflect. And then now you can put all this into practice for September. So it'd be nice to have a fresh start then. Bronnie, how do you ensure staff buy-in?
So I feel like for us, we kind of have the opposite problem to you guys, in the sense that our teachers are kind of confident generally with the English expectations of the curriculum, but it's that subject-specific vocabulary that actually is the main challenge for a lot of primary school teachers, because obviously, they might have a certain subject specialism that they feel really confident with, but for a subject like science, for example, there will be terms within that teachers, we have lots of newly qualified teachers working across our trust, they're just not necessarily confident with. So we've had to really push through our faculty teams and through our subject leaders that they are very much the champions of the vocabulary within those subjects, and it's their role, it's a key part of their role as subject leaders, that they should be supporting staff with unpicking that vocabulary, making sure that they have a good understanding, and making sure they're helping them to plan opportunities and context for the children to use that. But yeah, so it's kind of the opposite issue in a sense, that it's definitely involves, I think, some really passionate teachers that have that level of subject knowledge that are then able to really drive that forward and bring that passion, kind of like what Charlotte was saying about how teachers, you know, it's their subject, they love it. We kind of need to identify who those people are within our schools and make sure that they have the opportunity to do that.
To drive it, yeah. Okay, I like that. That kind of brings us on to, or I put together a little table, just kind of what is it that we are talking about. So it's sort of, you've got your unique subject specific disciplinary literacy, and then you've got common whole school literacy, and it's balancing the two of those. So I just, these are just my thoughts on it. You can add to it if you so wish. And then I put sort of here, you know, we need students to understand you know, meanings of words, be able to use them, practice them, all being touched on by you guys. And then, you know, what we need to tackle head on are sort of misconceptions, differing meanings, and the thought process that goes on behind sort of language learning. So what is the process, and giving students that strategy with it so they can do it completely independently. They were just my thoughts as I was putting this together, and I thought it might summarize what you guys have said. We do have quite a few questions to have a look at. So just before I go on to the questions, I really liked this sort of phrase, disciplinary habits of mind, and it taps into everything you guys have been discussing. You know, read, write, communicate, like in that particular subject. But I think it actually begins with thinking, you know, thinking and speaking, and then you get onto your reading and writing, in my opinion. Tell me if you disagree. You know, yeah, so that was just one thing that I thought was quite interesting. Literacy skills are both general and specific. So it's just, I know in some schools that I have worked with in the past or have worked in, it's been like, right, we'll tick off whole school literacy with this marking policy, right? So everyone's going to highlight this particular thing. And actually, there isn't a clear impact, and it doesn't quite work in certain subjects. And I quite like that disciplinary literacy warns against that. It's like, actually, we need to look at the whole approach and whether it is nuanced and applicable to all subjects. Would everyone agree with that or disagree?
Yeah. I completely agree. I think literacy is not an initiative. And that's that sort of what you were saying about that tick box, we'll just do a marking policy, sounds like an initiative that gets forgotten the next time you have a twilight on a new initiative, for example. And literacy is not that. It needs to be a living, breathing entity in every classroom, in every subject. And I couldn't agree more with what you said.
Yeah. And I guess with the students thinking and speaking and reading and writing we need to do that as teachers as well. And that comes with it being specific to the needs and the purpose and the audience of what we're doing that day. So yeah, all of you sort of discussed auditing and reviewing, and so I'm going to leave that there. And I know that on the link, James has been sharing with everyone the actual EEF recommendations we've been talking about. But let's have a look at a few questions. I'm just going to leave you with MAPA there, because that is very much our, as Bedrock, it's the evolution from Bedrock vocabulary. People from different subjects, you just load up your tier 3 vocabulary curriculum and select. So it's kind of like the Freya model, but it's automated and it's driven by that deep learning algorithm and saved in their knowledge organizer. But teachers having the control to be putting on what they want in a tier 3, you know, so science teachers and maths teachers can use it as well. Right, okay, questions. Were there any that jumped out at you guys before? Because as I told you, I'm not very good at doing 2 things at once. Let's have a look. Here we go.
There's a question about oracy, which I'm going to actually answer with another question because I thought it was a really good one. And I wondered if anyone else had any ideas about oracy at all.
Oh, well, oracy, I know that School 21 have a brilliant oracy policy. And actually, in a way, that is a good way of approaching the general, because oracy is going to be important across the board. And, you know, although you don't always want to write full sentences and responses across all subjects, it's good to speak in full sentences. So that might be one policy that actually has a big impact, I think, on students.
That's really interesting you said about Voice 21, because that's we're hopefully investigating that next year with a partnership there. So I'm glad that you endorse that. And I know a lot of schools use just something simple as we have shape. So just kind of saying to students that you're going to, speak loudly and clearly and in full sentences, and just kind of like as one very simple as part of our literacy basics, which is in every classroom, that we want to we're kind of relaunching for next year, because we noticed that was just a little key area where it was dropping, that kind of expectation.
And was that dropping since lockdown? Sort of, I can imagine that's had an impact. Or
I think it was just us noticing a lot more as well, that we had it up on our walls that this was something that we're doing, but then we were thinking, well, actually, are they? And definitely, I would say, with the masks on and all of that, it's kind of compounded that issue. But now that we're in a place where we're kind of thinking about September and what expectations we want to have, but just from that basic of full sentences and loudly and clearly, but also using the vocabulary and stepping up the vocabulary or rephrasing things in the right way is definitely a key part of that.
Interesting. How do you tackle disciplinary literacy when it comes to digital literacy, i.e. use of language in digital settings, social media, messaging apps? I think this kind of taps into code switching, which is talked about a lot on the Oxford Language Report. Actually using language differently depending on the context. What do we think?
So we, as a trust, we have one-to-one access to devices for all of our students. So every student has a device that they have access to in all of their lessons. So this is something that we do have to kind of consider. And I think for us, it's been very much around explicit. It's more around the students' use of their literacy skills, because we did notice there was such a huge difference in terms of what they would produce, particularly in their written work, when they were handwriting it versus when they were typing it or taking part in discussions on like message boards or polls or that kind of thing. So for us, it's been very much around raising the expectations, modeling good expectations, and not accepting lower standards in that than we would in terms of their written work. But that has been a bit of a battle, because obviously they are in the habit of doing that, as we all are, in our personal use of those technologies. But for us, it's just about really ensuring the teachers are driving those expectations in the same way that they would be with the written work. I just wanted to add something really quickly to the oracy question as well. We have a really good tool that we use at our school called Flipgrid, which is free to use. I don't know if anybody's heard of it before, but basically what it is it's a platform which, as a teacher, you can give the students a stimulus, so whether that's a picture, or you can record a video posing a question, or there's a variety of different things, and then the students log on, access that, and then they reply through recording a really short video themselves. And we found that to be a really powerful tool for giving all students the opportunity to develop those oracy skills. It's something they can do as part of their home learning, or they can do it in the classroom. So I'd really recommend looking into Flipgrid as well as an opportunity to develop those oracy skills.
So Flipgrid is the one. I'm just thinking, your students being at primary school, it's really, really good. It'll pay dividends if you are expecting high things on the computer, because it could be that they're writing their GCSEs, if it's still GCSEs, on computers by then. That might be all they're working from.
Wouldn't it? I wonder if that will happen. It kind of feels like that, it's on the horizon, isn't it?
Yeah. Any other questions? We had, where did the term come from? Was it the EEF? What happened to subject-specific literacy? I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that. But I mean, it taps into discipline, as in, the discipline of English, discipline of geography, but who knows? I would like to sort of end there to say thank you so much. It's been really interesting and insightful hearing from all different perspectives. And I think, it all comes back to that professional learning, everything that you're doing being, seeped in research, and keeping on monitoring. I like what you said there, Krisha, always reevaluating and auditing where you're at to move forward. But I really, really enjoyed talking with you all today. I hope you all did too. And thank you so much for attending, to those that are there. Thank you. Keep an ear out for the podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.